I'm delighted to be moderating this webinar for the Friends of the ABC on truth in political advertising. As a former ABC journalist, particularly my years on the Late Line program, the phenomenon of politicians not telling the truth during election campaigns and perhaps other times was ever present. But with the spread of AI, deep fakes and fake news, those in the media and all voters are more vulnerable than ever to those who deliberately spread disinformation and misinformation. The reality is that with increasingly sophisticated technology, it is easier to fool all of us. The ALP government has signalled electoral reform to promote truth in political advertising will soon be on the legislation agenda, but we are yet to see it. Our two speakers tonight have spent much of their careers studying and dealing with truth in the political arena and its impact on democracy. Ullrich Ecker is Professor in Cognitive Psychology at the University of Western Australia, and Geoffrey Watson is the Director at the Centre of Public Integrity. We'll be talking to them shortly. But first, Zali Steggall is the federal member of Warringah. An independent, the former barrister and Olympic skier, famously defeated the former Liberal Prime Minister Tony Abbott to take the seat. Zali has submitted 3 private members' bills to Parliament to address truth in political advertising. She was to have been with us tonight, but had to last minute withdraw after a request from the Prime Minister to accompany him on a political delegation. But before she left, Zali pre-recorded a video on the subject, which we can watch now.
Hi everyone, I'm Zali Steggall, the independent member for Warringah, and I send my huge apologies that I'm not able to be there to participate in this great discussion with Friends of ABC. I'd like to start by paying my respects to traditional elders of the land on which I come to you from, which is actually I'm in Parliament, so Ngunnawal and Ngambri people in the region of Canberra, and acknowledge the incredible custodianship of this land. Unfortunately, I've had to go away on a parliamentary delegation and so can't attend. But this is such an incredibly important conversation. We know we need to protect our democracy and make sure voters are protected and have an informed choice. Our democracy depends on voters making informed decisions, and that can only happen when they have access to real facts, right, to truthful information. And we know the power of advertising in this context. Misleading political ads undermine the democratic process, and they create fear and confusion instead of a fair debate and exchange of ideas. What I find fascinating in this space is that as a society, we protect ourselves as consumers, right? We have Australian consumer law to protect our money when we are making transactions, when we are buying or selling or purchasing services, and we protect Australians from being scammed from their money through the Australian consumer law with banning misleading and deceptive advertising. But we clearly have failed to value our voting rights as highly as our consumer rights, because we don't protect ourselves when we're exercising our vote in the same way. We do not have legislation that outlaws misleading and deceptive political advertising. It really doesn't make sense when you think about it, and why should politicians be held to a different standard? Does not make sense. I certainly was shocked when I got into politics in 2019 that was the status quo. So in my first term in Parliament, I went about change and I introduced the Stop the Lies Bill. And I've pushed on a number of occasions to suspend standing orders to force this to happen. Labor, whilst in opposition, actually committed to it, and when they gained government this term, they did indicate they would legislate. but we are waiting. I've since reintroduced my legislation, now named voter protections in political advertising. But despite sort of a commitment by the government, we really have not seen it. We haven't seen a draft exposure or a commitment. And actually, the minister has indicated that they will water it down, that they will walk back some of the provisions. Now, my bill is based on legislation that has been in place for over 20 years in South Australia, and has now been in place in the ACT. Not pretending that it's perfect, but it absolutely acts as a deterrent from bad actors. We know in this day and age we need to do something about this. Our laws have not kept up with technology. There is a real risk of misleading and deceptive advertising spreading like wildfire and impacting the views around facts for voters. So, and what's really fascinating is that voters of all persuasions support this. No one wants to be lied to by politicians. Everyone wants politicians held to the same standard that they are in their lives, and I absolutely agree. So it's really important that we pass this. The other aspect is the rise of AI and deep fakes. Currently, there is no law around needing to disclose when AI is used or when a deep fake is made in relation to advertising and in particular in political advertising, which is really concerning because we have so much content that is online, that is public, and what can be made of that content is incredibly misleading and deceptive. In fact, the AEC Commissioner has warned that this next Australian federal election is completely unprotected and unprepared for what will be the first AI election. We saw recently the UK election was mired with misleading and deceptive information and deepfakes, and we're obviously seeing the rise of that in the presidential election in the US. So incredibly important that we do something about. Now, we saw in the referendum there was a lot of claims and contention around the information available, especially online, and how quickly that gets pushed out to voters. But what was interesting, exit polling from the referendum showed that 83% of no voters and 92% of yes voters support regulating political advertising. So ultimately, people want to be able to at least trust the information they see, and then they will decide, how it resonates with their views. So that's really important. Now, we know everyone has used this loophole, right? I'd say arguably at the moment, we know historically we've had the Mediscare campaign and the death taxes, right? Coalition and Labor have used it, but I've also seen it from the Greens. I've definitely seen a lot of misleading and deceptive advertising around the status around some of our current issues that are in the political arena, and so it's really important that we cut down on this. I think the government has acted to outlaw sexual deepfakes, but I really don't understand why they're not going further. I think we are entitled to know the content that we are viewing, and if it's not going to be outlawed, it at the very least should be disclosed when there is AI and deepfake. So the higher standards are incredibly important. In the absence of political will by the government and the opposition to do something now about this for the next election, I've committed to working on a voluntary ethical code of political advertising that I'm currently drafting, and we'll be putting that to all participants of the next election because I think it's really important. But ultimately, we need to legislate this so that it has bite and that there are fines that can actually apply to bad actors. We know this is so important. So I really look forward to the discussion you're going to have. I hope it's really productive. Friends of the ABC, you are an incredible body of people, active and really engaged and committed to protecting our democracy. So thank you for all your passionate work.
So that was Zali Steggall, the independent MP for Warringah, who unfortunately couldn't be with us in person tonight. And before we go and address some of the legislation, what could happen and some of the points that Zali raised, I wonder if we could start by getting back to some basics, Jeffrey Watson. What is misinformation and disinformation, and how does this impact on our democracy and political system?
These a difficulty in regulating in respect of or controlling in any fashion what politicians, political parties say, because you are delving into areas where there could be a division between fact and opinion, between aspiration, between promises, predictions, etc., etc. When we're talking about something which could be regulated by Zali's proposal, we're actually talking about something where we're talking about statements of fact, or purported to be statements of fact. So it's actually attacking carefully a fairly narrow area. Now, whether you describe it as misinformation or disinformation matters not from there. The words in her proposal are misleading or deceptive, words which are very, very well known in Australian law and have a meaning which can easily be applied.
So, Ullrich, what makes certain types of misinformation so effective in gaining acceptance and then resistance to subsequent attempts to correct it?
Thanks, Maria. There's a fair amount of stuff that I actually want to highlight. It's a pretty big question, so I'll take a little bit of time to walk through that if that's okay. So, as Jeffrey alluded to, it's important to think of all types of misinformation, right? There's a lot of talk about probably easy to spot fake news. There's talk about disinformation being, misinformation that is created on purpose with the intent to mislead. But there's all types of other misleading content, conspiracy theories, propaganda, and lots of misleading arguments that may actually contain a kernel of truth, but they use flawed logic or emotional manipulation, right? So no legislation would be able to ban all those misleading arguments from political advertising, but I think a line could be drawn reasonably at something that is objectively false disinformation, such as, Trump's stolen election lie, for example. And it's important to consider these different types of misinformation because they have different purposes, right? Some types, they will try and directly persuade and influence people's beliefs and maybe even their voting behaviors. But often the true purpose of misleading information is to sow distrust, to polarize, to confuse, to fatigue people up to the point where they throw their hands in the air and go like, well, the truth is too difficult to determine. And that's, I think, a very dangerous, slippery slope because it leaves us in a situation where anything goes and there is no longer agreement on any basic ground truths, and any fact can be countered by an alternative fact, as famously coined by Trump advisor Kellyanne Conway. And as Zali mentioned, a democracy can't really function if there are no shared ground truths, because if there's a problem, climate change, whatever it might be, and there's no agreement that there is a problem, because some deny the evidence, well, then there can be no meaningful, genuine discussion about what to do about the problem, right? So we have to acknowledge that there are objectively established facts and therefore objective falsehoods. And let's not pretend this is some sort of radical idea, because humankind has built, science and legal systems and journalism, and they all aim to determine truth, right? It's not perfect, but they get it right most of the time. So from my perspective, the most concerning effects, I think, are that there can be these indirect influences on public debate and on social division. And it leads to a situation where vocal minorities can often spruik misinformation, and this leads to what we call pluralistic ignorance, meaning that people who actually hold an accurate majority position perceive themselves as being in the minority, and that can lead to their beliefs and attitudes shifting towards this minority position that is just out there and being talked about very loudly. So yeah, that's sort of the answer to the first part of your question. But let's just briefly, the second part was about what makes misinformation effective and how can we correct it. So misinformation can be very effective. It often appeals to emotion, which can attract attention. It makes people who are in an emotional state, they don't tend to think very analytically, so they act more on instinct and impulse, and they might share something that is actually not true because it appeals to them emotionally. And it's important to keep in mind that misinformation is not constrained by evidence or reality, so it can be made to be very novel and interesting and outrageous. And those are exactly the things that are pushed by algorithms on social media, but they're also the things that mainstream news editors like. They like to push stuff out there that attracts a lot of attention. And Zali mentioned AI and deepfake technology, and that comes into play here as well, because things can be made even more interesting and outrageous through use of AI. Another thing that misinformation that is highly effective does is present simplistic cause and effect relationships that might not capture real world complexities, but are just very psychologically attractive because people like simple explanations. And perhaps most importantly, misinformation often is designed to play to existing stereotypes and biases and attitudes and fears, which are often themselves grounded in misperceptions. So it becomes this sort of vicious cycle. Think of a young person exposed to racist tropes. They've developed anti-immigrant biases or stereotypes that makes them vulnerable to migrant misinformation, that kind of stuff. And again, AI can be used to tailor misinformation to particular groups and make that misinformation more persuasive to those groups. Finally, your question about how to correct misinformation. It's actually a challenging task just cognitively, psychologically, to update your beliefs, to update your knowledge. And therefore, we find that misinformation, even if it is effectively corrected, often continues to influence people's thinking. And often, even if a correction is immediately effective, the misinformation can often reappear later down the track. It's just a very difficult task cognitively. And then on top of that, obviously, if we're motivated to believe something because it fits with our attitudes, and if we maybe distrust the source of the correction, and that's obviously a problem that is growing, the distrust in institutions, distrust in politicians, distrust in scientists, unfortunately, sometimes for valid reasons, can lead people to be very skeptical of corrections when they are encountered. So yeah, that's sort of there's things you can do to make corrections more effective. Use simple language and nice graphs, and not just explaining that something is false, but also why it is false and what the facts are, and maybe why the misinformation was once believed. If the misinformation uses a particular manipulation technique, to explain that, and ideally to use sort of a source for the correction that is a trusted in-group member. So there's things we can do to make corrections more effective, but by and large, they're not perfect, and misinformation tends to have these lingering effects.
All the indicators are that we're in for an avalanche of misinformation ahead. And Zali quoting the Electoral Commissioner saying we're unprepared and unprotected really does sound a big alarm. And I'm wondering, Jeffrey, with the Australian Electoral Commission and the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, which are both frequently in the firing line about how elections are conducted and reported, how important is this legislation to those institutions and indeed to the wider media?
Well, see, I'm a lawyer. I'm inclined to look at things in terms of laying down rules, giving guidelines, providing guardrails and protection. So I think that it's actually quite nuts that we don't have anything in place at all. It's obviously necessary, and may I say, it's pretty obvious that it can be done, because South Australia's had it in place for 20 odd years and the wheels haven't fallen off there. So that something like this, which Zali proposes, which is, by the way, very modest in its demands, is a good idea. Why? Because it actually can lead to a penalty being imposed upon a political party, because it can lead to a penalty being imposed upon an individual, for example, a rogue operative, or even somebody higher up in the organisation, such as the secretary who must approve the advertising material. They'll think twice. And if they stop and say, well, hold on, we've got to comply with this, or at least we don't want to transgress it, you've got to start. Now, there's also a lowest common denominator factor here. I heard Zali's comment about the Greens, and they'd be scratching and clawing at Zali if they knew that she was saying that they've sunk to that level, but they have. And everybody does. And why? Because if the major parties are getting away with it, if they're doing it and it's giving them electoral success, you're losing out if you don't engage in the same low conduct. And the fact is, if it can lift the standards from the bottom what a great thing.
So surveys have shown that the general public is way ahead of the political process in this, and that people overwhelmingly want this change and want legislation. Ulrich, what does it take to shift the politicians to go in line with what the people want?
Well, they seem to be benefiting from this, right? So they obviously don't want action. And there's this perverse situation now that they're the ones legislating themselves, basically. So, there's there's a very obvious conflict of interest. So it does need public pressure, um, you know, and through the Friends of the ABC, that's one obvious outlet. And there is very strong public support for this. Some people, and we're probably going to go there soon in our discussion anyway, but some people allude to free speech as we can't tell people what is true and false and so on. But people aren't, if you look at the survey responses, people aren't actually that concerned about freedom of speech. They're certainly not concerned about the freedom of speech of companies and corporations making false advertising claims, right? They're also not concerned about politicians' free speech. They're much more concerned about being misled, about, their rights to being well informed and to be able to make up their own mind based on actual evidence presented to them and participating in meaningful debate in a functioning democracy. I think that's the thing that people are most concerned about, right? They're concerned about Australian values being upheld and liberal democracy as we have it being attacked by various forces. That's what they're truly concerned about. They're not concerned that much about freedom of speech. They're concerned about their right to be well informed and not being lied to and manipulated.
So freedom of speech, Jeffrey, is invoked frequently when somebody doesn't want to make a change. What's your view on the distinction between freedom of speech and legislating in this way on political advertising?
Look, it's not an easy line to draw, but it can be drawn. Now, what we call freedom of speech in Australia is the implied freedom implied into the Constitution of political communication. That's never been held to protect lies or deceitful remarks or misinformation or disinformation, whichever expression you wish to use. There's a line there, and it'll be easily found by the courts and determined. You've got to remember that quite often the greatest advocates for free speech are the greatest sources of misinformation. And that's not a coincidence. It's a bad argument. It's a bit like patriotism or calling something un-Australian freedom of speech. Anyway.
Ullrich, can we talk about how do you educate people? How do you think we can directly educate the public to identify political misinformation? It's not easy, is it? But what sort of ideas do you have?
Yeah, well, there's quite a bit of research being done on what to do. And the basic gist of much of it is that misinformation often has sort of fingerprints, flawed logic, misleading argumentation techniques that you can identify and that you can teach people to identify, and they can learn to identify these fingerprints. If you explain to someone what it means to cherry pick data, they will be much less susceptible to cherry picked arguments moving forward, right? To have real impact, though, these kind of lessons need to be provided repeatedly and systematically and covering a wide range of techniques. And so therefore, they actually need to be implemented at scale. And look, some countries have done this. There's some Scandinavian countries, for example. I think Finland introduced a new secondary school curriculum about 10 years ago, where they do this very systematically, not just in secondary school, but starting in primary school and all the way into tertiary education. And they have implemented information literacy classes or not classes, into information literacy aspects into all subject areas. So you can talk to students about lying with statistics in math lessons. You can talk to them about propaganda in history lessons. You can talk to them about image manipulation in art, about weasel words in language classes, political misinformation in political science, and so on. So it's something that actually is quite easy to introduce just across the board. And I know a lot of teachers do amazing work in classrooms doing these things, but it's not as systematic as it could be. So yeah, unfortunately, that requires a long-term investment and planning and resources and political will and so forth. In the short term,
happening in Australian schools or educational institutions at the moment on any organised way?
yes. Well, look, I can't say that I'm totally across the entire school curriculum, but I know that other countries have implemented this in a more rigorous and systematic manner. That's not to say that we're not, Australia is doing nothing, or that, as I said, I think there's a lot of great things being done within the existing framework in schools. I just think that it could be widened and made more systematic across the full spectrum of education. Now, there are things that can be done more in the short term. So, for example, Google has, through its sort of research impact arm Jigsaw, has deployed what we call inoculation videos. So that's basically videos explaining misleading argumentation techniques that then help people better identify those misleading arguments in the real world. And they've launched those ahead of elections in Indonesia and in the European Union, translated into all European Union languages and rolled out at scale. So those things have proven effective. They're not a silver bullet, but they help. There's always going to be a role for basic fact checking. And yeah, I think legislation certainly also has its place. And I just want to make one other point, that the legislation would not just serve to suppress some misinformation. I think what is not far more important, but even more important, is that such legislation would actually send a signal that as a society we value truth. We do not accept twisting of facts and denial of evidence, and that we also expect leaders to lead by example and serve as role models. So it will also have these more signaling impacts, apart from the fact that it would also reduce the amount of misinformation that gets out there and the impacts that might have.
So all of us probably participating here, Jeffrey, have come up through an era where we'd had much more concentrated media. We would all be reading the same articles, with watching the same things. But the young generations today, it's not like that at all. Their information sources are completely fragmented. And I'm wondering, what do you see as the extent of the dangers for young people coming up to voting age, or in fact who might be voting now, to be able to discern the truth when their sources of information are so fragmented?
I don't know. And you know what else? Nobody knows. This is partly because it's happened relatively quickly. It's also happened in a space where we are reluctant to regulate because people say, oh, well, don't clog freedom of speech. But nobody's carried out these studies. Now, Ullrich is as close as we've got to the source of knowledge of this in Australia. And it's a pity that Maria made the mistake of asking me this question, Ullrich, rather than you. But put that aside for the moment. The point is, as best I understand it, nobody knows. And that's one of the reasons why I would stick my neck out and say it'd be a good idea to try Zali's legislation. If we're in a medical mess, we would experiment by trying and testing certain cures. Why not try this one?
Yeah,
there's an opening for you.
I'll take that. I mean, it's partially true that we don't really have the answer to that question, but I want to make a couple of points. One is that, yes, younger people have a different type of media diet than maybe we have or we used to have. And look, having one central source of news, as in the one dominant TV news channel or the one dominant newspaper, that's fine if that channel or that newspaper is entirely objective and gives you all the facts and the facets. But that's usually not the case, right? I actually think the high concentration of media ownership that we have in Australia is a bigger threat than this fragmentation, because very few people determine what everyone sees. It's a wacky example, but there was a Media Watch episode a couple of months ago, I think, on Amazon Prime Day, where you could order things on Amazon cheaply or whatever. I don't actually understand what that is, but what I did notice was that the mainstream news brought this segment on Amazon, like it was almost like an advertisement. And I thought, what? It's not that unusual, but I was still taken aback a little bit. And then I watched this Media Watch episode, and the exact same message was broadcast on pretty much every mainstream news channel in the country using the exact same wording. And that just shows how a very few people have such control over what Australians are exposed to. I think that's the greater risk. But specifically to the fragmentation issue, yes, there are these people who get stuck in what we call echo chambers, and they just go down a rabbit hole, and they just get more and more extreme content. Those people exist, and they're dangerous, or can be dangerous. And I think that's something worth paying attention to. But the vast majority of people actually still get a reasonably balanced exposure to different types of channels and conversations and newspapers and online papers and things on social media that are news content. So I wouldn't worry too much about that fragmentation aspect per se. I think this type of person that gets stuck in this real echo chamber and just watches, the really hardcore extremist content, they're far and few between. So I think most people still get a reasonably varied diet, and it doesn't actually contain that much misinformation. I think the mainstream news channels are often the channel I'd worry more about, where there's things that are systematically distorted and presented in a certain fashion because the person at the top wants to promote a certain agenda. So I think those kind of, maybe not outright false or outrageously false things, but systematically biased and misleading content is probably a bit more to worry about in terms of the influence that it actually has on people.
And Jeffrey,
And Maria, I did tell you should have asked Ullrich. I was right.
I'm wondering, Jeffrey, he brought up the subject of a lack of diversification in the commercial media, and I'm wondering how much you think this also adds to it. I mean, we look at the Murdoch family with Fox News in the States, where a certain section of the population will only watch that because it's saying what they want to hear.
Well, I mean, this is obviously a genuine problem that channel was set up really on a commercial model, which was tell the people what they want to hear. And it actually moves what they are saying in the event that they're losing any of their audience. It's actually quite extraordinary. So you have a look at that and think, well, that's a deliberate manipulation, yet you call yourself mainstream media. This is Ulrich's excellent point, that because of that, that can be more dangerous than things on the internet, insofar as at least people can say, I don't know that this is an authoritative voice. But I've got my own particular gripes here. But Australia's leading broadsheet, The Australian, I mean, it's quite funny. I set myself ever against ever paying for a copy of it. But I glance at its headlines and it makes me laugh because you see the front page and it's got a political slant from the front page through to the back. Now, is that a problem for Australia? Of course it is. Is it a problem for the world? Of course it is. I'll tell you something else, Anne Maria. I'd like to set this test. And for those people listening in, you ask yourselves right now, without a doubt, the most powerful Australian ever born is Rupert Murdoch, the most influential Australian ever born. Tell me who's the second. I'll tell you the answer. It's Howard Florey. And not many people in the street would have heard of him. And think about this. I wonder whether there's been more damage done to our democracy and to democracies in other Western countries than has been done through the Murdoch press, but I'm very biased.
Well, also the Murdoch press is relentless, as often as the coalition, to either dumb down or get rid of the ABC altogether. What do you think the value of the ABC is currently? It is often controversial, but by and large, we're all hoping as the Friends and certainly the ABC alumni that with proper funding, it retains its independence. But how do you think it's travelling in this space now when we're talking about delivering coverage of political events?
I think it's an essential component of democracy in Australia. I'm a university teacher. My students ask me, because they're kids, where can I learn? And I tell them the reliable sources are the ABC. I tell them that after that, the BBC, that near that and close to it is the Guardian. And I've always been very biased in favour of the Sydney Morning Herald, being a Sydney-sider who learnt to read, reading the Sydney Morning Herald to my parents. So that may not be a fair one. But where else would you send people, young people, to learn about what's going on and where we're placed in the world?
So we've established that overwhelmingly people want this legislation. What does it take to shift the dial? And as we've now heard suggestions that the Greens are down in the misinformation world as well, do you think that Albanese government will act? Legislation's sitting there in the back row somewhere.
I've been going down to Canberra over the last several months on the broader reforms promised by Senator Don Farrell in relation to election funding. And I've been going down there waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting. But I will tell you one thing, everybody in this country should fear election reform legislation if it's generated bipartisan between the Coalition and Labor, because all it is doing is protecting and entrenching the cartel. And the absence of the election funding reform, which was also one of the key promises of the Albanese opposition, it's a worry. It's been very delayed. And it looks like if it hits the decks, I'm not sure, it can't be voted on this year. That means it's unlikely to pass in this period of government. I just have a look at some of the reforms which are proposed, for example, Zali's reform, and think, why can't that be done as a one-off? Why is it going to be tied to omnibus legislation by Senator Farrell? But no control will be ceded over any aspect of it. I'm pretty sceptical of this process, and Maria.
Yeah, I mean, the way I see it is that it's going to be very difficult in the current climate where sometimes people seem to make a point of disagreeing even on things that everyone should agree on, just to make a point that we're not going to agree with the other lot. And this polarization and division that we see play out in Parliament is going to make it very difficult for this to be passed. So I'm equally skeptical. But in the long run, it'll take people like us and like Zali in this case, and maybe there's other independents coming in to keep bringing this topic back, because it is such a no-brainer actually when you start thinking about it, because no one is proposing, as Jeffrey said, the proposal is very modest in what it wants to achieve. It's not radical in any kind of sense. No one's trying to really restrict the messaging that politicians and political parties can make. I think it's just an attempt to bring things back to, evidence-informed policy making. That's what election campaigns should be about, right? We want to know, how do you plan on addressing these problems? I think people are getting really, really sick of this adversarial finger pointing and pulling people through the mud. It's always been an aspect of politics, of course, and it probably always will be. But I think the extent of it, I think people are getting sick of it. And the fact that people, thankfully, in this country are asked to vote, I don't want to say forced, but they actually kind of have to engage to some extent. Hopefully that amounts to some sort of pressure in the future that this will be passed.
Well, there's the number of the Teal independents. I think most of them are supporting this, if not all of them. And you would have heard Zali say, well, if the legislation doesn't get through at the next federal election, she'll be coming up with a voluntary code for and asking all politicians to participate. Now, Jeffrey, is that something easily dismissed, or do you think with the public spotlight on it that she may get some traction there?
Oh, it's a great idea. Again, by the way, this whole idea is aspirational. Nothing wrong with that. That idea by Zali is aspirational. But you've got to bear in mind, the only way that this will work is if it gives a sting to those who breach it. And it's very hard to get people to agree to a code which would make them subject to a hefty personal fine. So it probably won't launch. It'll be like something designed by Elon Musk. But the point is that, again, it's placing pressure. For years, I said that one of the key factors in us ever getting a Federal Integrity Commission was the fact that an independent member of Parliament got a draft bill and placed it on the table of Parliament, where it sat staring at Labor and the coalition. Now, again, Zali's doing the right thing here. Just bear in mind, if the two parties of power, coalition and Labor, agree on federal electoral reform, it'll be designed in some way or another to entrench the cartel.
I
Now,
can just say a few words to that as well. This has been applied in the US. The obvious issue is that often the people who don't sign up to these kind of codes are the worst offenders. It's also been tried in Australia by Simon Longstaff, the executive director of the Ethics Centre. He's created a politician's pledge, but that was only taken up by one side of politics. You could guess which one that was. He also created a banking and financial services oath, which was more successful. So these things have been tried in the past. The trick is to really get everyone to sign up to them, and that's the obvious constraint. So, and another danger is, of course, if we implement that, then people might say, well, we have that now, we don't need to legislate, right? So that's always a bit of a risk, I guess.
Yeah. So we saw an escalation in AI and fake news in the UK elections, and now in the United States. Donald Trump, on the other hand, is taking things to a new level, I believe, with direct threats against the media broadcasting things he doesn't agree with. I recall many journalists, including the ABC correspondent in Washington, on the day of the 6th of January attack on the Capitol, Catherine Diss, were fearing for their lives. Then the cameramen, they were cowering down and being attacked by his supporters as they had been branded enemies of the state. Now, a few days ago, Trump attacked CBS for its 60 Minutes interview with Kamala Harris, and he posted on social media, "Take away that CBS license." There seems to be a real threat that if he is re-elected, he will force media organisations off the air altogether. Jeffrey, first, do you think that that's achievable?
Just bear this in mind, one of the arguments that he uses to support that preposterous proposal is freedom of speech. He says that freedom of speech has been compromised by CBS, etc., etc. So you go down there. I mean, I obviously, like most thinking Australians, are very concerned about what's happening in the United States because, well, you know the old saying, we're 2 hours behind New Zealand and 10 years behind the rest of the world, that we will follow in their footsteps. I just don't know what to make of it because it's a true problem there. If you think about it, in the upcoming election, it's only weeks away. It's almost certain that something in the order of 80 million Americans are going to vote for him. What does that tell you about a country? By the way, a country with which we've just become
Embedded.
entered into an alliance. I'm sorry, that was a rambling answer, a non-answer rather. But
But I just I wondered too, Ullrich, what do you think of that flow-on effect is here? I mean, we all remember. I think it was Trump who first used the phrase fake news to dismiss anything he didn't want to engage with, and then I recall Scott Morrison starting to use the phrase quite a lot, not that long after. But do you see that the harm of that flow-on impact?
Yeah, absolutely, and that's why I think part of the benefit of such legislation would be to, as I said earlier, to kind of force politicians to be better role models and not do these kind of things of calling everything they don't like fake news, and bringing the attention back to actual evidence. I'm a little bit on the fence here. On the one side, Australia is not the US. There are, similarities, but there's also marked differences. For example, we've run pretty much the same study in the US where we exposed people to a lot of lies, either from Trump or from back then Bernie Sanders. It was harder to find the lies from Bernie Sanders, but we did find some. And we found that no matter how many lies people were exposed to, once we fact-checked them, yes, they reduced their specific beliefs in those lies, but it didn't affect their support or their voting intentions at all. If we run the same study in Australia, back then it was Malcolm Turnbull and I think it was Bill Shorten at the time. We compared those two. First of all, the lies that they told it was difficult to find them because they didn't actually say things that were outright false all that much. But the ones we did find, we used in that experiment. And it turns out that, as in the US, if we fact-checked the false claims, people reduced their belief in those false claims. But they also, if they were exposed to more lies than truths from the politicians, they reduced their support for these politicians. They really didn't like being lied to, more so than in the US. And of course, in the US, their whole electoral system is very different from here, and I think they have much more benefit from trying to address the extremes, whereas in Australia, I think politicians try and focus on the middle, right? So I think there's marked differences that make me slightly more optimistic. But that being said, I think it is a risk that these kind of things, set an example and have more influence here as well. So yeah, I'm a little bit more optimistic maybe than Jeffrey, but I do see it as a real threat. By the way, these death threats and so on that have been, or threats in general that have been launched at journalists in the US are also being launched at people like myself who study misinformation, people like Jeffrey who are active in this space. There's quite a substantial movement in the US trying to silence these people under the guise of freedom of speech and drag them into hearings and drown them in FOI requests and even lawsuits brought against them, forcing some of these research centers to shut down and funding being withdrawn, simply because people are monitoring the information environment and pointing out where there is misinformation being spread.
Have you actually had death threats, Ullrich?
Me myself, no, because I'm in Australia, but colleagues of mine in the US have. Actually, even colleagues of mine in Australia have, but that's some time ago when it was more about climate misinformation during the so-called climate wars. Yeah, personally, I have received death threats, but only from my wife.
And Jeffrey, have you? He roped you in there. Have you? I mean, you running an organisation that.
Oh, sorry, I've received death threats, but not in relation to this work. Nowhere near it. No, I've not received any abuse. I received a very polite email from one of the people who I'm hoping is tuned in this evening, Chris Dixon, and it was a very, very sensible email. It was the pushback I got on this occasion.
And I think I just wanted to check with Cassandra Parkinson from ABC Friends whether we have some audience questions. Cassandra. Doesn't seem to be happening.
I'm coming. I'm just turning on my video.
Okay. We have some questions from the audience.
Yes, we certainly do. We've got more than we can handle. but there are a lot of good questions. So I'm just going to do what I can to pull them up. I'm sorry. Here we go. So the first question is an ABC related question. And how can the ABC best protect Australians from deliberate misinformation? And related to that, how should the ABC be playing a role in developing information literacy?
So who would like to start with that? Ullrich, I think.
Yeah, I think the ABC could probably do more in terms of information literacy education, but it's not its primary role. So anything the ABC could do to highlight more science-related content and broadly speaking, information literacy relevant content, the better from my perspective. But it needs to be done in a way that it's appealing to different audiences, especially also younger people. And obviously the ABC's role is not primarily to serve as an educator in the literal sense of its word.
The Media Watch does do this to an extent, but maybe there's room for another fake news program focusing on that in a way that's accessible.
I think it will be popular, and I'm declaring myself available.
Available? Jeffrey, do you have anything to say about that?
No, Ulrich's quite right. It's not actually the ABC's job, but it makes me think, perhaps federally, at the very least, there should be some organisation given such a role.
Cassandra, another question.
This is a question asking whether, and I don't know whether our guests can answer this, whether the legislation that Zali proposes would also apply to third parties that are linked to political parties, such as, well, one that's been mentioned is Advance Australia. Would they also be subject to the legislation?
On my reading, no, but that's partly because this is, as Ulrich and I have agreed, a modest step. It's a modest step in the right direction. You should always regard anything to do with election reform as being like a taxing act. It's got to be monitored, watched, worked out where people are getting through the loopholes and close the loopholes. So that's why I say it's not a bad idea in terms of if you compare it with a clinical medical test, to try it out, see what works, see what doesn't, and see whether it can possibly be amended to be better.
Ulrich, what do you think about that? Third parties.
Yeah, I mean, of course, if you make people not do something using one avenue, one channel, they will look to do the same thing with a different channel, right? So I think key there would be to enhance transparency and make those links more transparent to the public. But I don't think the legislation could technically cover all third parties. I mean, that's unless there is a general law that is passed, I don't see that working. I think then there'd be
seat we had Advance Australia very active, and also Getter on the other side of the coin. But so certainly our so-called sort of comfortable Northern Beaches electorate is full of fire when it comes to the election campaigns here with third parties.
Yeah, and I think, look, it'd be nice if they were also included, and if there was some sort of general law that covered all bodies that make public announcements. But yeah, we also have to be realistic, right? So,
Cassandra, another question.
Yes, this question: the common response to a trusted source is to deny that the source is trustworthy. How do you overcome this denial? I think Ullrich, you probably are well placed to give us some advice on that.
I think the answer to that, from my perspective, is there's no short-term fix. We all know that trust is slowly built and quickly lost. So we all just need to do a better job. And I say we because we're all in the everyone who's sort of at least vaguely in the public sphere, if it's scientists or journalists or politicians themselves.
I think Cassandra's talking more about an anonymous source.
Yes, for instance, on social media, I think that's what the questioner was saying. If, for example, you're on social media and you see, obvious fakery, how do you use a source and you say, well, this is what this person's saying. They say, well, we don't believe them. Where do you go from there?
But I think that's a fair response. If you know nothing about this source, you don't know if they're trustworthy or credible or what their background is. I think generally being skeptical of the information you're given is not a bad thing. I understood the question more as, if you say, here's a scientist, they're going to tell you, the truth about the vaccines or whatever it might be. And then someone who is anti-vaccination in this example, they will immediately dismiss that trust and say, well, they're not trustworthy because they don't like the message, right? But the only response to that is to rebuild some of the trust that has been lost in these institutions. Generally, trust in scientists, for example, is still very high in Australia, amongst the highest in the world. But trust in politicians, obviously not, and for very good reasons. So I think this is another benefit that legislation like this could have. If there was more truth-telling, then people could also trust those sources more. But I think that's the gist of this question, is that we need to have sources that are trustworthy, but it also means talking to communities and engaging them so that people can receive information from sources that they do trust, that are part of their community, rather than from some, member of the elite trying to tell you what is true and what is not. There needs to be more communication with specific communities and engagement with those communities and listening to their concerns so that you can rebuild that trust and have sources that are trusted. I think that's the key here. Anonymous sources of the internet will never really be trusted, and neither should they.
Another question, Cassandra.
This one, I think, is for Jeffrey. Can you document what exactly the Greens have done that leads you to say that they've sunk to that level?
No. I'm sorry. I was just repeating what Zali said.
Oh, I beg your pardon.
Yes. And so whoever has asked that sensible question, I'm fobbing it off.
Yeah, we'll
she's currently not available.
No, to answer.
But I have no doubt. I have no doubt.
Very good dealings with some people from the Greens.
Yeah, I have no doubt she would offer up that information if she was here.
Yeah.
I can just say to that the data are reasonably clear that, at least in the US, where most of the research is done, that misinformation is not produced equally by both sides, and also not consumed and shared equally by both sides. So there is this pocket of highly engaged conservative voters that share the majority of the misinformation online.
And to tell the truth, I was surprised when Zali said it. But anyway.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's Parliament. A question here, and I don't know that you can answer this, is who would arbitrate and enforce Zali's proposed voluntary code of conduct?
Well, that's actually one of the crucial design features, because you've got to set that up. Now, in Zali's model, it would be the Australian Electoral Commission. In the South Australian model, it's the South Australian Electoral Commission. Similarly, in the ACT. The point is, should you have an independent body? There's been a lot of resistance to this kind of reform around Australia and in other parts of the world on the basis that it would politicise the electoral commissions. So that's a very, very awkward question. If, for example, an electoral commission seeks an injunction to prevent a Liberal Party ad going to air, it might look like they've entered the political playing field. They don't want that role. They also say that it'd be a use of their resources which might detract from their ability to conduct elections. Okay, fair enough. On the other hand, we do have some lived experience here. The head of the South Australian Electoral Commission, Michael Sherry, he has reported that he thinks it works well, that it's compatible with what they do. They use their similar legislation, quite modest in its demands, quite modestly in its own way. It's led to a few prosecutions. Some would say the fact that it's led to few prosecutions means it's a toothless tiger. I would say maybe it proves that it's working.
And can I just add that we need to push back against this notion that, facts are subjective and that, people don't agree. And if you look at the data, fact checkers, if you have multiple independent fact checkers checking statements, they correlate very highly, not just with each other, but also with bipartisan groups of people who, as you know, something called the wisdom of the crowds. If you take 100 people and ask them for their opinion, on average, they kind of get it right. If you take people who are either left-wing or right-wing and you look at their ratings of statements and claims, they correlate highly with independent fact checkers. So people can find agreement on many things. That's not to say that there are things that people will disagree on. There's always going to be gray areas. But the fact that there's a gray area doesn't negate the existence of black and white, right? There is still black and white, and people can agree on those things. So I don't think it's an impossible task. It's just something that needs to be properly resourced, and it needs to be someone's job, and they will do it.
And Zali's legislation takes a view, which is, and all the experts agree that this is the way that it should be done, takes a very narrow view of that which would be challengeable. That is, purported statements of fact. You can work out pretty clearly when something is a prediction, a promise, an aspiration, or a purported statement of fact.
Cassandra, we've only got time for one more.
Okay, this is a question that a couple of people have asked. And the person says, you'd think that with trust in politicians at a low, that a bill like Zali's would be something that would be welcomed. But would it be something that only happens if you have a larger crossbench?
Well, that could well be the case in the next year. But Jeffrey, what do you think?
Oh,
The number of hands that go in the air is often a very compelling way to get things done.
again, see, part of the problem here is that you've got external political factors which are manipulating the situation. One is when you've got two parties of power, they will do everything as between themselves as to does any duopoly. That is, they'll work together to exclude third parties, new candidates. That's one political pressure. Another one is this. If Mr. Albanese says black, Mr. Dutton will say white. So you've got this kind of relentless oppositionalism, which means that true reform is sort of stopped dead in the tracks of pure politics.
Ullrich, did you want to buy into that?
I don't really have anything meaningful to say.
It's
Yeah.
all it's crystal ball gazing, isn't it, the outcome of the next election? But Cassandra, is that it? Do you think with the questions?
Well, there are more, but those were the shortest, I suppose. So,
Well, they were all very good questions.
They were great. Yeah, they're fabulous. Thank you, everyone.
All right. So final comments. Where are we at? How optimistic? I think Ullrich seems to be slightly more optimistic. But if you were a betting person, Jeffrey, are we going to see Zali's bill on the floor of Parliament within the next 6 months?
50-50.
Okay.
Ullrich?
I'll say 51-49.
Which way? We won't even ask you which way. We'll just we'll take our comfort from that.
Yeah, my hunch is that maybe the outcome of the next election will determine whether this will get up or not.
Thank you. So I guess that wraps it up for tonight. So I would like to thank all of you for joining us here tonight. I'd particularly like to thank the Friends of the ABC for organising the webinar. And of course, I want to acknowledge the ABC alumni, of which I am a member, for continuing to lobby the federal government and others to keep the funding up to date with the ABC. it isn't, by the way, but it's better than it was, and to keep the national broadcaster independent. I'd like to thank Zali Steggall for preparing that, well, first of all, by putting up the bills to Parliament and then preparing the video for us tonight. And of course, I'd like to thank Jeffrey Watson and Ullrich Ecker for their fantastic contribution to the webinar tonight. Before I go, I'd also like to pay a personal tribute to George Negus. I worked with George when I was a reporter producer at Foreign Correspondent, and he was definitely a one-off person, an unforgettable person, a very big, larger-than-life character, and he was a very important figure in the ABC for a number of years. So I'd like to send my condolences to his family. And on that note, I'll say good night and hand over to Cassandra Parkinson.
My job's just to say a few more thank yous. Thank you again to our speakers. I've just learned so much tonight. It's been very, very helpful. And thanks to Anne-Maria for moderating. It's great to see a professional in action. And I'd also like to thank a small group from ABC Friends who put this together, from ABC Friends New South Wales. That's Bruce Stevenson, Bill Howes and Ross McGowan, who did all the work to organise this event. And thank you to Phil Evans, who's been in the background managing all the tech stuff. We're very grateful. And I would also like to thank Tess Howes, who's our New South Wales president, who unfortunately is unwell and wasn't able to be here today. Otherwise, she'd be here in this very moment. And I'd certainly hope she's going to get better very quickly. Thanks again to everyone. I really have found it so incredibly valuable. We have recorded the event, and it will, once we've kind of done any necessary trimming, it will be placed on our website. And there's a few quotes in there that I hope we might be able to use in the future. You've given me certainly ideas. I think there's a lot of work for us to do in trying to support this very important, not just the legislation, but just this very important issue. Just for our guests, I'd remind you that, the reason why ABC Friends has organised this event and other similar events is because we really do believe that the ABC plays a crucial role in helping Australians come to some sort of shared understanding of what the news is, and is, such an important trusted source of news and information for all Australians. So I encourage you to consider joining or come onto our website and at least sign up and receive our monthly newsletter. Thank you again, everyone. It's been a great event, and I hope we can follow up with more. Thank you.